When I was 24 years old, I got a call at work. My coworker said, "There's someone named Jerry on the phone for you." And I froze. I absolutely froze because the only person I had ever met in my life named Jerry was my first boyfriend's mom. And I started crying as soon as I heard her voice, the second I heard it. I started crying because when you get a random phone call from your ex-boyfriend's mom you haven't spoken to in 3 years, the news isn't going to be good, whatever it is. But it turned out it wasn't about him. What happened was his best friend, Brian, had shot himself. He knew I would want to know, but he wasn't yet ready to talk to me after all that time, so he had asked his mother to track me down and find me to tell me. Brian's death made people very uncomfortable. Most people around me in my newer life, in the life where he hadn't been a part of, they mostly pretended it didn't happen, or they downplayed it and downplayed the effects that it had on me. I remember one of my coworkers saying, "I just don't understand why you are reacting like this about somebody you knew from high school." I wasn't sure what the point of his reaction was, but a few months later, when an acquaintance of mine also died by suicide, that same coworker said to me, "You sure know a lot of people that kill themselves. I wonder why." I'm not friends with that person anymore. Though I do wonder what happened in their life that made them have so little compassion for people who kill themselves. And as for Brian, it wasn't just the past that I was mourning. It was the future. I had hoped for a day when we were friends again, when I had a life that he was part of again. And his suicide solidified that picture that I had in my mind that I thought my life was going to look like was never going to happen. Unfortunately, the conversation about his death never got that deep. I didn't even get to share that with anyone because honestly, nobody wanted to talk about it. Around the same time Brian died, my uncle Michael died of a drug overdose. I actually didn't know at the time that he had a problem with mixing prescription pills with alcohol. And my aunt and him were separated at the time, but she didn't tell anyone why. She didn't want to talk about it. If I told people my uncle died, they immediately expressed sympathy. "I am so sorry for your loss." But if I looked at somebody and I looked them in the eye and I said, "My uncle died of a drug overdose," they were more cautious with their condolences. They waited until more details unfolded so that they could form their opinions. "Oh, it was prescription pills. He had prescription pills and it wasn't heroin. And oh, he had a legal prescription because he injured himself at work. Oh, a house collapsed on him and he was in pain and he was given that prescription that he died from taking. Oh, he was white. Oh, okay. He owned his own home and that's where he died. I am so sorry for your loss." But since Uncle Michael's death, I literally know dozens of people who have died of drug overdoses. Dozens. People who are homeless, people who aren't white, people who use heroin, IV drugs. I've known dozens of people who've died from drug overdoses, and rarely are their stories afforded the same respect. And while there is certainly no right or wrong way to die from a drug overdose, gauging people's reactions over the years has shown me that there are individuals in the world who believe that some deserve more empathy than others. Fast forward several years, and my stepfather also shot himself. He had attempted suicide many times before completing it. He had brain damage. He'd got brain damage from being a boxer, and he was diagnosed bipolar. And he also struggled with substance use. And he had a chronic illness that he was too ashamed to tell people about. His parents told everyone he died of a heart attack. The hardest death for me, actually the worst thing that's ever happened to me in my entire life, was my grandmother dying. But she had dementia, and she had pancreatic cancer. And she lived a good life. She lived a long life. And while the situation was complicated, people usually feel more comfortable when I talk about that death. They don't feel as ashamed when they say to me, "Oh, that is how my loved one died too." Or at the very least, they'll feel comfortable in the knowledge that my grandma died a death that they seemingly can't assign blame to. Comfortable enough to say, "I am sorry for your loss," without worrying about the details they might be scared to know. People are afraid of talking about death in general, but they are especially afraid to talk about deaths that leave them with questions. Because of the stigma of mental health issues, because of the stigma of drug use, even AIDS before that, people usually want to know more before they actually can be comfortable with certain deaths. Whether it is because of their curiosity or their discomfort, they can't just seem to say, "I am sorry for your loss." I want people to ask questions, and I want people to talk about death. But because we all die, and because that death is literally a part of everyday life, not because we have social prejudices. I facilitate a death and dying discussion group that is open, free to the public. You're all invited. Everyone's invited if you want to come. Because I do this because I want to make people feel more comfortable talking about death. But I train people how to prevent and respond to drug overdoses because I want people to understand why people use drugs. And I want them to understand mental health issues and to end the stigma of drug use and mental health issues in my work. To understand that suicides and drug overdoses are just as tragic as other illnesses, period, and they shouldn't be treated any differently when someone dies. Talking about death doesn't cause it to happen. I know a lot of people believe in bachi, but believe me, if talking about death killed you, I would be dead 100 times over. I wouldn't be standing here. And because my two biggest passions are talking about death and talking about drugs, I do make people uncomfortable. I used to be self-conscious about this. I used to feel really weird about it, but I've learned to embrace it, and because really, I am here. I'm here in this room to make you uncomfortable, and because if we don't have discomfort, if we don't let ourselves be uncomfortable, we never change and we never grow. Thank you.